Hey everybody, welcome back to Xi4P Podcast. This is the Daily X, where we bring you news, information, and discussions about your favorite Marvel comics, most notably the X-Men. I'm Nico, and you guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at NicoAction. That's NicoAction. This next segment is one of my favorite we've ever had the opportunity to record. As a collective group, one of our favorite X runs is X-Men Legacy by Mike Carey, featuring a host of brilliant artists covering characters like Xavier and Rogue, while also inventing incredible AUs like the Age of X. Mike Carey came through and talked about his incredible Vertigo library like Petrefax, Lucifer, and the Unwritten, as well as his work at Boom, his novels, and more. This was such an incredible opportunity to talk to a master of craft about the work that we love so much that he has worked so hard to create. If you guys like what you hear, you'll probably like what you hear elsewhere on this channel, so don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and a review. Check out this interview, and we'll see you guys soon. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Xi4P Podcast. I'm Nico, and you guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at NicoAction. That's NicoAction.
I'm Josh. You can find me at Asleep at the Wheel, WEIL, and asleepatthewheel.com. And for the next 2 years as the Progressive Democrat running for U.S. Senate in the state of Florida, you can find me across social media at Wheel, the number 4 U.S. Senate, and at joshwheel.org.
Hey guys, I'm Drew. You can find me online on Twitter and Instagram at Drewsper3. That's at DREWSIPHER3.
And now, heading from Lucifer to a guy who's probably best known for his breathtaking work on the Morning Star himself, X's4 Podcast is incredibly grateful to welcome Mike Carey to the show. Mike, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. Good to meet you guys.
So for those of you who are somehow unfamiliar with Mike Carey's work, which would mean that you probably skipped everything Marvel and Vertigo for a solid 2 decades, right? Mike Carey is responsible for the breathtaking work on X-Men that led into the X-Men Legacy years, and himself the pen man on X-Men Legacy, as well as the incredible work on Hellblazer, Unwritten, Lucifer, one of my all-time favorite stories from the Sandman universe, Petrefax, and the incredible Felix Castor novels, the Rampart Trilogy. It is so exciting to have you here to talk about all of this amazing work.
Thank you.
How is it now with sort of the way your work has exploded in the last few years, your characters in X-Men and Lucifer on TV, Hellblazer in Legends of Tomorrow? How does it feel seeing this work everywhere?
It's pretty cool. I have to say a lot of that stuff doesn't owe much to the source material. I really enjoy Lucifer, but insofar as it's based on anything, it's kind of based on Neil's work in Sandman more than on my work in Lucifer, I think. Although some of the characters like Amenadiel were characters who I added to the mythos. But it's great that the stories that began in comics are now getting a huge multimedia exposure. It's great that so many of the things that I loved that were niche when I was a kid are now culturally mainstream. And it's always exciting to see someone pick up a baton that you've tossed, kind of thing.
And I actually had the pleasure of speaking with your former editor, Alyssa Kwitney.
Yes.
And she wrote a Rogue novel in this last year. And I said, oh, this is some of my favorite Rogue work since Mike Carey on X-Men Legacy. And she absolutely went crazy and could not wait to read every page of Rogue you've ever done. And she wanted me to tell you that the two of you need to meet up when the whole world is back to normal and you two can grab a drink.
That would be great. That would be great. Lisa gave me my big break. In fact, she did it twice. My first ever Vertigo work was commissioned by her. And then just before she went off on maternity leave, and actually in the end went off to become a writer rather than an editor, she also, the last thing she did was to ensure that I had another commission, which was Petrefax. So I owe her an enormous amount. And I also learned a lot about writing from her.
That's, she actually said almost the same thing about you. She said that, well, she did discover your script in sort of a pile of scripts, and it spoke to her. She discovered so much about character depth and nuance by working with you. And it's just so nice to hear two people I have such respect for have respect for each other, because I feel like that's rare nowadays.
Yeah, I guess it is. I guess we're living in a kind of a crueler and a harsher age in some ways. Alyssa was amazing because she'd studied narrative at university and she was just so switched on to story. She was a hands-on editor in all of the best senses. And I guess that was true of the Vertigo editors as a group. They were all trained and inspired by Karen Berger, and there was an ethos there, and it was an ethos that was sort of based on an absolute respect for story. And I guess the primacy of the writer as the sort of engine for story. You were allowed to call your own shots in ways that I don't think you were at other imprints necessarily. When we decided to end Lucifer after 75 issues, nobody suggested that we should carry it on. That was just taken as given that if the creative team wanted to wind up the story, they would be allowed to.
And I really appreciate that you made a comment specifically about how you feel that Lucifer and a lot of the other TV work maybe borrows a bit more from Neil Gaiman's work on the character than necessarily your narrative. Now, for my wedding, my husband got me a copy of the issue of Seasons of Mist with Morpheus and Lucifer, and we had it signed by Neil Gaiman.
Cool.
And I have the key to hell sitting up on my desk. So Lucifer is a big deal to me, and I frequently source your article that you wrote for the Vertigo on the Ledge column about how Lucifer is in some ways an autobiography of who you're not. And I found your take on Neil Gaiman's structure really unique. You managed to map a course of 75 issues, much like Sandman, with one special, Nirvana, much like Orpheus, but at no point did Lucifer overly lean on the laurels of what Neil Gaiman's Sandman had designed initially. Was it hard breaking free of, the, in many ways, father of modern myth, Neil Gaiman, a man who has so reshaped fiction? Was it difficult finding your footing for Lucifer?
I guess to begin with, I wasn't even trying to break free. I was trying very much to write in the spirit and in the tone of the original, to create a continuity. And I think if you look at Morningstar Option and if you look at Six Card Spread, the two first arcs that I wrote, they're borrowing Neil's voice, they're borrowing Neil's cadences, borrowing Neil's structures. Obviously, I draw on Neil's structures throughout, but I think it wasn't really until Born with the Dead that I kind of had the confidence to start not pulling away from that template, but start creating my own spaces within it and start developing my own universe within the Sandman universe, or at least my own sort of test lab for some of the themes and characters that I wanted to explore. It was a joy. I was having far too good a time to actually be terrified even. If I'd stopped to think, that I was following in Neil Gaiman's footsteps, I probably would have been paralyzed. But it was just a blast. The whole thing was just a dream come true. I thought then, and I still think now, that Sandman created it created a kind of Kuhnian revolution in comic storytelling. Neil was doing something that nobody had done before. I mean, you could argue that Alan Moore gets close to it in Swamp Thing, but I don't think we've had before a novel or a novel sequence told in comic form over that sort of scale, and told in that unique way of intertwined storylines and characters and arcs. It's almost like listening to a fugue in music, listening to some kind of piece of Baroque music where the instrumental voices and the themes come and go as the piece continues. And I very much wanted to do that, wanted to have a crack at that. So I guess short answer, I wasn't pulling away so much as kind of reinventing a lot of what was already there.
And, saying that it sounds like a fugue, I mean, the first thing I think of is Preludes and Nocturnes being the first arc of Sandman.
Right.
And in many ways, the final arc being Overture. And, in saying that you feel like you were really true to the idea and broke out on your own, my favorite appearance of Death ever is in Purgatorio. So I feel like you did really take those elements and you really did sort of spread your wings. And there is something really true about maybe finding your own voice as the series goes on. But one of my favorite things is in Six Card Spread, and how much your narrative voice of this idea of sacrifice and loss is central to a hero's journey is a very prevalent element of your storytelling, whether it's Felix in his novels or it's Tom Taylor, who that now there is a Tom Taylor writing comics that makes my life so much harder on Google sometimes, right? But, that idea that loss generates future is such a prevalent element of your work. And is that an intentional thing, or am I just, saying a thing I've noticed?
I think if you're going to tell a story, I think the way I wrote Lucifer, I wrote it as kind of a meditation on free will versus determinism, addressing the question of how far any of our actions can ever be free. And I was kind of tackling that on different scales to some extent. And it always sounds weird when I say this, but to some extent, Lucifer is everyman in that he's a person trying to break free from parental influence, trying to find a way to just be himself and not be an echo or a kind of a semi-programmable subset of his father, which is obviously particularly challenging when your father is God and literally created the entire universe and is omniscient and knows everything that you're going to do before you do it. But I think it's to some extent it's something that everybody faces. The question of how far the origins for your actions, the origins for your motivations lie outside yourself, and that's kind of it's kind of a tragic aperçu, if you like. It's a way of looking at the world that tends towards tragic rather than comedic stories. I think a lot of my characters are trapped in situations that they didn't create. They're overwhelmed by forces that are bigger than them, and they're trying to find some kind of autonomy for themselves. And often that entails sacrifice. Often you need to cut off the limb that's trapped. You need to lose something in order to get free.
And I think that's really true of both Tom Taylor and Elaine in the pages of Lucifer, who makes a really beautiful mirror for Lucifer in that regard, where that idea of bigger than life expectation and free will action sort of come together. And on the subject of Tom Taylor, the Unwritten is in many ways, by my personal opinion, like such an important meta statement that allowed comics to continue evolving. And I would have read 1,000 Tommy Taylor novels. It wouldn't have even been an issue for me. Now, with Unwritten, Unwritten crossing over with Fables, which was like the craziest thing at the time. I was at the Comic-Con where Karen Berger announced that, and that's actually the day I got to meet her. And there's a picture of me like crying as she's being very nice about it.
Can I
But
tell you, as someone that had just read Fables and not Unwritten, that was wildly confusing from the other end.
oh
Yep.
no, I was the other way. I had stopped reading Fables. Now, that's sort of a question. How did Unwritten kind of come together and then, in many ways, kind of end very, I don't want to say abruptly, because Apocalypse was 12 spectacular issues, but I felt like I could have read a million more issues of Unwritten. Do you want to talk a little bit about Unwritten and that process?
Yeah, so Unwritten took an awful long time to happen. When Lucifer was wrapping up, Peter Gross and I were talking a lot about what we would do next, and we were both of us taking it for granted that what we did next would be with each other. We'd really enjoyed that collaboration. I mean, I love everything I've ever done with Peter. I think he brings out the best in me, and I think he enjoys drawing from my scripts, partly because we work in a very, very collaborative way. With most artists, I'm fairly prescriptive, but with Peter, the script is kind of a starting point for a conversation, and in a lot of ways, it ends up in a different place, in a better place than it started. So we thought we'll definitely do something else at Vertigo, and we pitched a lot of stuff. We pitched an idea, it was rejected. We pitched another idea. There was a period of like a year and a half, a little bit longer, maybe getting on for 2 years, when we were pitching and just hitting a brick wall, and we were kind of dismayed at that. We didn't know how to proceed with it. And in the end, what happened was Peter went away and did American Jesus with Mark Miller. I went to Marvel and did a lot of stuff there. And the whole thing was in abeyance for a while. There was a long time when, it felt like a long time, when we didn't have a Vertigo book on the go at all. But then we met up at San Diego Comic-Con with Pornsak Pichetcho, the Vertigo editor, and we started talking about a couple of ideas. Peter had an idea about following a character in real life and then following the same character within a narrative that was based on their life, but like exaggerated, distorted, changed a lot of things, and then intertwining the two narratives until the reader wasn't sure what was true and what wasn't. And I had an idea for a story that was about the magic trumpet in Indian mythology, which is blown when one age of the world ends and the next world begins. And I had an idea about a character blowing that trumpet and changing everything, changing the lives of everybody else in the world except himself, and then trying to find the people who he'd loved in this new world that he'd made. And Pornsak said, jokingly, maybe you could put the two stories together. And so we started to think about how you would do that, and that was the seed for Unwritten. But then the convention ended. We all went home again. Peter went back to Minnesota. I went back to London. Pornsack went back to New York. But Pornsack said, keep on talking. What I'll do is I'll phone you up. I'll hook you both in, and then you can keep on talking as long as you like on DC's dime. But let's see if we can turn this into a proposal. And at a certain point, I'd been reading the biography of Christopher Milne, who is the Christopher Robin of the Winnie the Pooh stories. And I threw that into the mix as well. Christopher Milne, famously a guy who is only known as a fictional character in stories made by his father. And he absolutely hated that growing up. It was a curse to him. He was bullied by kids at his school because in the Ernest Shepard illustrations, little Christopher Robin looks almost like a girl. They were sort of macho shitheads, and they teased him about that. They bullied him. He said, when he wrote his own autobiography as an adult, he said that he felt his father had stolen his childhood from him and left him nothing but the empty fame of being his son. So we reworked that. Imagine if your father, instead of writing Winnie the Pooh, had written the Harry Potter sequence or something very like it, a story about a boy wizard. So it grew from that, and it grew quite organically from that. We had a lot of it planned out. We always knew roughly where it was going to end up, but we also knew that we could go anywhere we liked on the way. We could visit any stories that we felt passionate about, because in a lot of ways, it's a story that is a love letter to the stories that have meant something to us. We had ideas like at one point we were going to have Tom trapped in a Jane Austen novel, but then there was a lot of Austen stuff going around at the time, so we decided not to do that. But it was kind of a voyage of discovery, and yes, we could have carried on for a long time, for a lot longer. There was a point where we were seriously discussing doing all of the Tommy Taylor novels as graphic novels, which was a crazy idea, which would have been really, really fun to do. But at a certain point, we thought we should probably wrap this up. We can still revisit the universe, but probably we should bring it to a conclusion. And that was Unwritten Apocalypse, just like 1 year of stories to kind of nail the original plan and bring Tom's story to a conclusion.
And I love hearing how much of your experience with Peter Gross is collaborative. I'm also a pretty significant Peter Gross fan. Some of my favorite issues of Books of Magic ever are his era, and sometimes when he would have Temujin come in and do guest pencils. And this sort of idea of a larger-than-life fictional character looking in on his own life is very true to a lot of Peter Gross's narrative storytelling across the years. And hearing that you guys are a collaboration and not just writer and artist, like, makes my world. And I need to let everybody ask you about X-Men, because that is a thing that we do on this show. I have one final thing. I have been lucky enough to speak to every main writer of Hellblazer ever.
Right.
And you are the last piece of a really significant puzzle in my life. And I have gotten the luxury of asking all of these incredible. Oh, I'm missing Denise Mina. I'm missing two people, yourself and Denise Mina. And once I get to speak to her, I'll have everyone. I think my question for you is, when you think to yourself, who is John Constantine? What version of the con man comes to mind? Do you see the street magician? Do you see the guy, sleazing his way through society to do what everyone else won't? Or do you see the down on his luck guy who just can't seem to get it right?
I guess I see him as the way Neil described him in the Books of Magic miniseries as the laughing magician. He's somebody who doesn't just talk to gods and demons and angels. He talks back to them. He's flippant. He's sarcastic. Nothing impresses him. He's humanity flipping the bird to eternity. That's John as I see him.
Wow, that's, and everybody's had an amazing answer. I think Garth Ennis's answer was something just like, he's an asshole. He just had no patience for my question in the best possible way. He was like,
Can we be fair, though, that's Garth Ennis's answer for every main character he writes?
That there's a story that Alyssa told me that, because I said I have to know, was the 90s at Vertigo like the actual fairy tale version of the Daily Planet that exists in my head, where the writers run in with, I got a story idea, and there's just like Karen as Perry sitting at the desk going, approved. Like, is that what it was like? And she took this beautiful beat of silence and then said, it was even better.
And like I sat there just holding my chest, and she's like, basically, it's exactly what you think. We're all sitting around, and Garth Ennis comes in, and please forgive the accent, Garth. I think she's even like, Garth, I'm so sorry about the accent. But he comes in, he goes, I got a fucking idea for a story, and like, it is just so magical.
It was. It was an amazing time. I was on the other side of the world, but when I dropped into the DC offices, it always felt like stepping into an alternate universe. It was just, too good to be true in a lot of ways.
I can't even. Well, I've talked a lot about this universe, and I know these two guys have as many questions about X-Men as I have about Vertigo. So I want to make sure that everybody gets their voice heard. So let me pass the mic over to Drew and Josh for a bit to
Sure.
ask some serious questions about some serious mutants.
And thank you, Nico. And I think Vertigo into X-Men is a great transition because when you first came onto the X-Men line, you followed a fellow Vertigo writer in Peter Milligan, who
Right.
had an absolute home run in his X-Force X-Statix run, and then was just finishing up on the main X-Men book in a less acclaimed run that you were going to follow up directly on. And so
It was a soap opera.
That's exactly what it was. Yes.
I
It's a satire.
didn't say it was bad. I said it wasn't the wild smash that X-Statix was. And no offense to many writers, it wasn't what Supernovas would be, which you came in kicking the doors down. But what was that transition like? And we love the inside baseball stories here. In terms of with Marvel editorial going from following Milligan with yourself and you coming in and starting off your run with Supernovas and the characters and direction that you were going to take them.
So the way this happened, I'd always wanted to write superheroes. I wanted to write for Vertigo as well, and that was something I was incredibly happy and proud to do. But I had a hankering to write superheroes. I'd always felt that superhero stories are a genre that comics invented more or less, and they've always had comics as their center of gravity. No matter how many movies or TV series or novelizations you get, comics are where superheroes live. And I'd grown up reading those stories, and I really, really wanted to tell some. So I was pitching stuff into the DCU, some stuff to the Superman office, the Batman office. I wrote some issues of Firestorm, but they were spiked. And it seemed at a certain point, it felt like I was kind of typecast. There was a compartmentalization at DC that meant I was always going to be the Vertigo guy, and it was really hard for me to be anything else there. And then again at San Diego, I met Axel Alonso, who was of course another Vertigo emigre who'd ended up at Marvel. And I was telling him about this, and he said, "Well, look, I know you're exclusive to DC at the moment. If you ever find yourself not exclusive to DC and you want to do some superhero stuff, call us up. We'll see what we can offer you." And I thought that was really nice. I didn't necessarily think it would turn into anything, but when I got home, I got a phone call from Joe Quesada, which was very short and sweet. It just said, "What Axel said goes for me too." So bear us in mind. And it was another 2 years after that. I let my exclusive lapse, which felt like a big deal, felt like a big risk. Tentatively called Axel, and he said, "We'll be in touch." And it was actually Ralph Macchio who got in touch and asked me if I wanted to do some stuff for the Ultimate line. I did Ultimate Electra and Daredevil. I did Ultimate Fantastic Four. But then there was a day when I got a call from Mike Martz. I got a call from a guy claiming to be Mike Martz, offering me a monthly X-Men book. I thought this had to be some kind of a gag. I almost told him I almost said something rude. But it really was Mike Martz, and they really were offering me Anti-Bibless X-Men. So I pitched this sort of wild, crazy idea. Obviously, this is when House of M is wrapping up. We're into the decimation. There are not many mutants left. So I pitched this idea for a team built around Rogue that would be like crazily unstable. That would be half villains, half heroes, already falling apart under its own internal tensions, even before it met any actual antagonists. And Mike said, "Yeah, fine, let's do it." And so it happened. It was an amazing thing to get to do. The X-Men were not the first super team that I loved. The first super team that I loved was Fantastic Four, but the X-Men followed soon after. And I was very young when I was introduced to them, and they'd always been a part of my life growing up. In fact, it was the X-Men that got me back into reading comics when I was in my late teens, and I briefly stopped because I discovered, sex and drugs and rock and roll. I was walking past the newsagents. I saw an issue of X-Men, and it was actually from the Starjammers arc, the original Starjammers arc. And the cover was giant fists smashing down, and the X-Men being scattered like nine pins. And I didn't recognize any of the characters except for Cyclops. So I picked it up out of curiosity, and that sucked me back into reading comics again. So the X-Men had always been there for me, and the experience of sort of adding bricks to that structure, adding stories to that mythology was just glorious, absolutely glorious.
Yeah, it's funny that so we're talking about like getting into the X-Men and stuff. It's kind of funny. My very first X-Men issue that I ever picked up was actually your part of your Red Data, the second issue of your Red Data arc. But one thing I wanted to ask is that you created the villains, the Children of the Vault, in the beginning of your Supernovas arc, which are now featured heavily in the X-Men. And I just kind of wanted to know, where did you come up with the idea for them, and kind of each, like, not each character, but the characters and their design, or their personalities and stuff.
I guess I wanted to create a new antagonist. I wanted to, even though I absolutely loved Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men, I kind of wanted not to do what he'd done. What Grant did was to take each of the big sort of the tent poles of the franchise and build a story around each one of them. So he has his big Sentinel story, he has his big Phoenix story, his big Magneto story, and so on. I kind of wanted to do something a little bit quirky and off to one side. So I thought I'll create something new. And I'd never read the story. Was it the Neo? The Neo that Chris?
Yeah, the Neo was part of Chris Claremont's Revolution from
right.
Uncanny like 381 to like 389, and X-Men 100 to 109.
So I'd missed that, and so I thought the idea of post-humans who were not mutants, a different group of post-humans, I thought it was a pretty neat idea. I didn't realize it had been done before. So I created the children. I decided to base them out of a South American country and give them Latin names, Latino names. So I just cobbled it together very quickly out of whole cloth, tried to give them like crazy over-the-top powers, make them a really formidable force, and then just throw my team into the middle of it. But one of the great moments from that first year was when I was about 4 or 5 issues into that arc. Someone sent me a link to a Wikipedia page for the Children of the Vault. I was already canonical. I was in canon, and that was a huge thrill. The idea that stuff that I was creating had become part of had become accepted parts of the story.
And I think we see that a lot right now. So much of your stuff, Drew just pointed out, Supernova's introduced the children. We see the children. North Star is back in a big way. Your work with a number of characters would ultimately go on to keep showing up.
That's the wonderful thing, though, I think, about writing within a huge franchise like the X-Men, that basically you're always planting seeds. That's the big strength that Chris Claremont brought to the X-Men revival. When he picks it up, he's constantly throwing out these seeds, which you'll pick up in a year's time, or 2 years' time, or 3 years' time. And you're doing that as a writer. Sometimes you'll pick the ideas up yourself. Sometimes you leave the book and then you see somebody else pick something up and run with it, something that you'd set up. And that's a lovely thing to see. It was great that after I left Legacy, that Cy picked up some of the stuff about Blindfold that I'd kind of layered in. It's a wonderfully kind of it's like one of those acts where a lot of people are juggling with the same set of balls or batons and throwing stuff to each other across the stage.
Cy loves him some Blindfold.
He's so much.
He's using her again right now in his new series. So
where he's also using Legion, who you used at the end of your Legacy.
Right.
The end of your Legacy. I don't mean like you're done. You're at your Legacy run.
No, and you did some really, really interesting and long-lasting things in the book, as Nico said, and you had some major stories, starting with Supernova, Messiah Complex coming after, which is one of the top X-Men crossovers of all time. You had Age of X in there. Now we saw, for my memory, your use of Cable as a supporting character, which is a very difficult thing to do, because Cable is a character that when he kind of comes into a story tends to have a very large gravity, and stories, I think, because of his complicated past, just tend to revolve around him. But using him so well as a supporting character for a while in your X-Men run, bringing Magneto back to, his role as, as a leader of mutants who was willing to make the tough decisions. Something that we'd kind of seen writers vacillate back and forth between, he's the leader of the evil brotherhood, mwahaha, to, he's this conflicted person who's going to do whatever it takes to make sure these tragedies never happen to his people again. So many great, threads and moving the X-Men line forward as a whole. I have to say, and I have to stop and talk to you about two particular issues that are my favorite, because it's not going to be the first, second, or even third time that I brought them up on our podcast. So longtime listeners know how much I love 215 and 216.
I literally had a note, make sure Josh talks 215, 216. Yep, no, that's literally in my notes. I'm not
you knew that. There was no way we were getting out of this without going into those.
Not a chance.
So is that when Professor X goes back to talk to Scott and Emma? Is that...
Yes.
Yeah.
It's I love it on so many levels. One of the things that bothers me about Xavier depictions by some writers is that, he has so many dark sides. We've seen, so many different dark sides of Xavier in Onslaught, or in, being controlled by the Brood, or in Cassandra Nova. But just that, Xavier isn't the best guy. Xavier has made a lot of really bad decisions, and people like to kind of sweep those away as, no, that was a corrupted dark side, and, you really gave us a full-fledged, a kind of morally imperfect Xavier that he was, and tying it at the same time and with a fantastic, empowering Emma issue that perfectly mirrored what Grant Morrison did to her with Jean Grey in 139, having her be the aggressor in this case, dragging Xavier through his story. It's two of my just absolute favorite issues, not just from this era, but all time. I love those so much. And I would love to hear you talk about, because I feel like there are, unless I'm reading into it too much, that there were lots of layers in what you were building there in that story.
Yes, I mean, there definitely are. I mean, throughout the Xavier run on Legacy, the Xavier arc on Legacy, what I was kind of doing was I was taking that character who, had been sort of brought near to death, but also shown to be so terribly morally compromised in the years before I took over. I wanted to have him and revisit all the different aspects of his past, and I wanted him to try to find a moral core to himself again. And obviously that wasn't going to come without pain, nor should it. The whole idea was to kind of drag him over the coals and to disassemble him, and then allow him to build himself up again, but allow him to do that by paying the price for the bad things that he's done. There was an exchange between Xavier and Scott and Emma right at the start of my run in Supernovas, where Scott is talking to Rogue about creating a team, and Professor X's take on what Rogue has just done is that she should actually be reprimanded rather than being rewarded. And he steps in to explain this to Scott, and Scott cold shoulders him and more or less says, you're not in charge of the X-Men anymore. It's not your call, and you're nobody to lecture anybody else on morally questionable actions. And he walks away, and Professor X asks Emma to intercede on his behalf, and Emma says that the X-Men are he's what you made him. All the X-Men are what you made them, but you do not get to change your mind. Only God has that prerogative. And in some ways, I was sort of those two issues were sort of calling back to that conversation, and they were also part of a process that ended in the issue when Xavier goes back to the Acolytes, goes back to Exodus, and dismantles the Acolytes without actually throwing a punch. Just basically talks Exodus around to admitting that just mutants fighting mutants is not the key to the future. That if mutant kind is going to survive, they have to find a new model for their interaction, a new set of rules of engagement. So it was all part of that conversation, I guess. And it made sense to me to have Emma become the arbiter between Scott and Professor X and kind of be the one who is setting the parameters in that issue. It has a weird echo in the issue very, very shortly afterwards, where Professor X meets the Juggernaut again, which is also to do with sort of taking a fight out of the sort of taking an argument out of the plane of reality and playing it out in a sort of hypothetical space.
Yeah, kind of in a way that just went on in the issues prior. So right after that, you start the Rogue storyline, and she's like a major character in that run. Out of the 200 mutants you could have picked from, what was your interest in Rogue, and like why did you pick her? Someone who hasn't been seen in like a leader light before.
I guess it was two things. I mean, I was looking in all of the characters I chose for my initial lineup. I was looking for characters that I felt I could voice convincingly. Characters I felt I got them, and therefore I could write them with a degree of authenticity. And I was also looking for characters who had kind of like storylines trailing, who had arcs that would be interesting to pick up, characters who I could move on. And I'm not saying that I was always successful in doing that. I mean, you mentioned Cable earlier. I think my use of Cable was problematic. It was problematic in a couple of ways. I mean, it dismays me to this day that because I put Cable into Adjectiveless X-Men, they wound up Fabian Nicisa's Cable and Deadpool comic, which I was loving at the time, absolutely loving. But they just decided if he was going to be in one of the frontline books that they would end that book. At least I think that was a factor in the decision, and I kind of hated that. But that's what I was doing. I was looking for characters who I could voice and characters who I could move forward in interesting ways. Obviously, some of the stuff I did with Rogue didn't take in the long run, but I think I took it to some interesting places, and I don't regret any of the decisions I made. Not even pairing her up with Magneto, which was probably the most controversial thing I did.
I'm sorry, big Magneto Rogue couple fan here. Don't really understand the Gambit love. Just don't get it. All about that Magneto and Rogue. Totally speaking my language.
I got such a lot of hate mail for that. It was kind of a shock. I mean, I sort of I cut my teeth on the Vertigo message boards where everybody was extremely refined and polite. The Rogue Magneto pairing kind of unleashed hell in some way.
You were actually kind of notable for several unusual pairings, also Mystique and Iceman, which, all things said and done, we're actually a very queer show. Like, the majority of us are queer, and
Right.
almost half of us are Latino. So, like, it's an interesting makeup. And so Iceman would get pretty gay shortly after you wrote him. He would still yet have one more significant girlfriend, and Kitty Pryde happened, and you had Mystique and Bobby, you had Magneto and Rogue. You really, that's a very like sort of Vertigo writer thing, coming in and saying, let's try some unusual pairings. And that's something that your run is kind of remembered for, that unusual dynamic of bringing Lady Mastermind in and really shaking up the status quo personality wise.
And I guess it was again, it's a question of continuity with what came before. You said that Peter Milligan had turned Adjectiveless into a soap opera, which I think is a really good way of looking at it. So to some extent, I was paying a little bit of a quiet homage to that, but also I think it's just interesting to see, to play what if, to put together people who you wouldn't necessarily imagine would have common ground. One of my favorites was Psylocke and Iceman in Age of X.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in with obviously Scott and Frenzy in Age of X, and
Yes,
how
yeah,
you
that's
nailed that one and then yanked it away from us right after.
My heart.
I had a great conversation on Cerebro the other week where we were talking about exactly this, and I said that Scott and Joanna were kind of like the irresistible force and the immovable object. And I got the answer, yes, but they're both. If you in terms of powers, Scott is the force and Frenzy is the rock. But in terms of their personality, he's the stoic one, and she's the kind of completely out of control one, which is nice.
The thing I loved about that was that I'm a huge Scott and Emma fan, and so as someone who loves Scott and Emma together, the fact that in a few issues you could make me so mad at Emma for dismissing and the way that she treated Joanna at the end of Age of X, even though I love Scott and Emma, was just, I mean, you had clearly gotten me invested in something that wasn't even like my main investment. In a short amount of time. Age of X isn't like a super long book. Like you laid that down and hit it strong very quickly.
It's only 6 issues, but it's actually going to be shorter than that. It's Daniel Ketchum. When I initially pitched it, I pitched it as a 3 issue arc, and he said, "Don't you think there's more there?" And he gave me the alpha issue. He gave me the 3 issues of New Mutants because we were in between creative teams on New Mutants, and then Cy came in to write the Avengers storyline. It became something bigger. It got a lot of in-house advertising, and I just had such a blast with that story. But yeah, I think Scott and Frenzy are kind of right at the heart of it. I really enjoyed writing her as a character. She comes and goes all the way through my arc. She's there very near the beginning, and she keeps on popping up through the Professor X issues, and then she comes in again at the end.
And I really love that Age of X wasn't the thing it was in. It didn't become what it was intended to be. Like, it's something kind of amazing. I made a post saying, I love Age of X. I miss Age of X. Happy anniversary, Age of X. And the number of people that interacted with it, comics professionals that were like, yes, yourself included, which is how we were able to book this incredible interview, which again, thank you so much for.
Oh,
And
pleasure.
just seeing this outpouring of love for an AU, Age of X really is like that 6 issues, but think about Age of Apocalypse, which is, at this point over 100 issues, and people are still talking about Age of X as well. It's got that Days of Future pastiness where I'm glad I didn't say Days of Future pastiness, that really captures what people love about an alternate universe. There's a what if element that plays against expectation, and that balance is super important. One of the things that I think stands the test of time about your work on Rogue is balancing our expectation of who she is with exactly where she found herself. Something I discussed with Alyssa is that she was actually only the second or third woman to ever write Rogue like properly as a writer, and
Wow.
that frequently led to a lot of writers writing, unfortunately, somewhat now viewed as problematic storylines where Rogue is a victim of being her gender. One of the things your X-Men Legacy sought to do was to redefine characters without the notion of engendering them. Your Xavier shows a sense of masculine and feminine vulnerability that we're not used to seeing from such a flat, usually, character. Your Rogue was dynamic and strong in a way that was militaristic, that sort of superseded the notion of her gender. Is that something that you go into, this idea of, I want to strip back your notions while playing with your expectations? Is that a big part of your writing, or is it just we're lucky?
It's not a conscious thing. I guess I don't really believe in gender. I certainly don't believe in gender essentialism. I think it's bullshit. People are just what they are, and I think there have obviously been societies that didn't have the same kind of respect for the idea of gender as a binary that we did. Societies in which it was sort of acknowledged that everybody had a little bit of male and a little bit of female in them, and where you found yourself on that spectrum might, to a certain extent, dictate the role you played in society, but it certainly didn't. It certainly wasn't circumscribed. So, I'm the least masculine man you're ever going to come across, I think. It's not something I think about particularly because it's not a determinant in personality as I see personality, if that makes sense.
It totally does. And it just occurred to me that your X-Men Legacy was the second time that the second X-Men book got an adjective, right? Because you said, I was writing adjective lists, and I was like, yes, he's a fan, because the entirety of X Twitter and X community calls it adjective lists, and it went from adjective list to new, and then back to adjective lists for the short Austin run, which became the not a short Milligan run, and then we wound up with Legacy. And in the time since, the writer of New X-Men has since come out as gender fluid and is a
Yep.
they. And, Grant Morrison is, I kind of like to think of New X-Men as an invisible cell. If you
Nice.
like re-encode it like that, and that Cassandra Nova is doing a sigil to transform the state of the universe, there's like this powerful through line there. So I tend to think that Grant Morrison is smarter than me any day of the week. But like this idea that two of the voices who both so shaped that series, as seminal as it is, bad choice of words, both sort of don't play by gender rules is probably a huge determinant in the fact that they're remembered for their Jean and Emma, and then later on Rogue. They're strong women in each of those runs.
That's a very kind thing to say. Thank you. I'll take it.
I would add in too that that's extremely important, that, to have the sensibilities like you and Grant brought to a title that featured so many strong and prominent female characters and yet was so infrequently written by female writers. I love when Alyssa came in here. I've read 1,000 comics with Rogue in it, and Alyssa explained her basic view of Rogue and had me realizing that I knew nothing about the character and had been seeing her wrong all this time.
I felt like a fool. I felt like a fucking fool.
It was amazing, and also just it made you kind of look back and go, man, like, some of these characters have they've been missing that voice, and we're incredibly grateful to be in an era of X-Men right now where we're getting a lot of those voices. But
Right.
So the work that people like you and Grant did was really important, especially for a lot of us who do not kind of relate predominantly to heteronormative narrative.
Right. Thank you.
And speaking of narrative, it would be super crazy to think that your entire body of brilliance exists solely in one medium. I myself, and I've mentioned them 4 times, I've cosplayed the character, right? Like literally went online, found that you could order whistles in different keys, and then had to find the right key. Ordered the wrong one on Amazon more than once. So I've cosplayed Felix. Like I'm a little attached to the character. A friend
That's
of
awesome.
mine is a librarian in upstate New York, and he made sure that that everybody heard about these novels. Oh, you read comics? You've probably read a comic by this guy. Check out these novels. And one of my best friends, and he was like, I don't know how you don't know these. And I read the first 2 because that's what had come out at the time, and like it was one of those things where I would reread them just to because I don't have the next one yet. I don't have the next one. Like it was an intense relationship because I had missed your John Constantine for so long. Not that, I mean, Pete Milligan. Pete Milligan is like my hero. You, Pete Milligan, Neil Gaiman, you guys all wrote this collective character group that are so significant to me. And not that Pete Milligan's work on Hellblazer didn't do it for me, but that was right around the time your novels were coming out. And it was like, it's more of John without being John. It's a new take on the character. And, from that novel to your newest novel series, do you want to talk a little bit about whether it's Felix or Trials of Koli, some of the stuff that comes together for what makes your novels different from your comics?
That's an interesting way to frame it, because I totally agree with what you said earlier, that the Castor novels are kind of like John without being John. I was obviously writing Hellblazer at the time when I started writing Castor, and Hellblazer was my foot in the door. I'd written a couple of, well, more than a couple. I'd written about 4 or 3 and parts of a 4th novel when I was in my 20s, and they were terrible. They were just really, really badly structured, which didn't stop me from sending them to publishers and collecting rejection slips. But I kind of, it was through writing comics that I kind of finally got my head around story structure. I finally got to a point where I could put a novel together with confidence, because the difference between them is that a comic is a frame of a fixed size. It's 22 pages or it's 20 pages, and you've got to tell your story within that scope. If you run out of pages before you run out of story, too bad, you're stuffed. So I'd learned to sort of to cost out a story in terms of beats, and to think consciously about the placing of those beats. And I had an editor. Well, there was an editor I'd met before I started work on Hellblazer, Darren Nash. And when I was writing Hellblazer, I showed him some of my Hellblazer issues, and I said I could write a novel or a novel sequence that was kind of like that in flavor. And he commissioned the Castor books. So it definitely does start out, I think, as being very, very Hellblazer inflected. I think it probably goes its own way over the course of the 5 books, but it has a lot. It still has a lot of Hellblazer in its DNA.
I frequently actually say, "Do you like The Conjuring? You'll love these," because I feel like the novels, because at this point they're a few years old, but they were thematically very much where cerebral horror was headed, especially in terms of emotional beat, character development, pacing, and the idea of cost and responsibility. And I feel like that is definitely a through line we see in modern cerebral horror fiction. That it starts out maybe John adjacent, but it finds its own footing, and its footing is a very modern voice.
I think the point where Felix and John have most in common takes us back to what you were saying earlier about loss. Every victory they have is a Pyrrhic victory. They always come away from every big fight limping. There's always a sense that you can't be who they are without paying for it, and that the price is always going to be a little bit more than you're prepared for. But yeah, so my prose work definitely sort of arises out of my comics work to a very large extent. But something happened to me around about 2010, 2011. I started on a collaboration with my wife, Linda, and our daughter, Louise. We wrote two novels together, City of Silk and Steel and House of War and Witness, which were, broadly speaking, they're fantasy. They're kind of, one of them is a historical fantasy, the other is kind of an Arabian Nights pastiche. But they're portmanteau novels. They have lots of stories within stories, lots of switching of narrative voice, switching of pace. And I came out of that in a very different place. I was writing for 3 years. I was writing with two women who already had their own voices, had their own sort of ways of approaching story, and we had to triangulate on a form of storytelling that worked for all three of us. And it was coming out of that I wrote Girl with All the Gifts. And it was also coming out of that I got my new pseudonym, which is M.R. Carey. We were talking about this right at the start. My middle name is James. The reason why I'm M.R. Carey is because there's already an M.J. Carey on Goodreads, and she writes bondage pornography.
I did this. I made this happen. You're so welcome.
But yeah, so I think everything I've written since Girl with All the Gifts is kind of different. It's different in terms. It's more experimental in terms of voice. So the Rampart Trilogy, which is the most recent thing I did, is kind of me doing a post-apocalyptic Huckleberry Finn. It's a story told by a character who is barely literate, who has learned very late in life to read and write, and has his own kind of hacked about, ham-fisted way of using the language. But at the same time, there's a kind of poetry to the way that he gets things wrong. And it's set 3 centuries in the future. Our world has ended in climate breakdown and also in war, resource wars. And there are a few pieces of technology that have survived through those 300 years for various reasons. And ownership of those things basically determines your status in this future world. And the main character is somebody who steals a piece of tech, thinking it's a weapon, but actually it turns out to be a music player, a media player, who becomes his best friend. I'm really, really proud of how it came out. Particularly proud of it as an ensemble piece. There's a sort of strong cast of characters. They're all given their weight as the story goes on, including Monono Aware, who is the personality inside this media player, who is a dead Japanese pop star whose personality was sampled just before she died, and who has spent 300 years sitting in the dark by herself with no user to talk to, and then meets Koli, the protagonist.
The idea of emerging voices and transformative narrative is, very true to your work over the years that we've already discussed. And I love that, especially as fans of yours, we look for that, huge team, because even though Lucifer was an ensemble around Lucifer. Your Hellblazer
Yeah.
had some of the most consistent number of recurring figures of almost any of the runs. And we've praised how much your X-Men book felt like a team book, even when it was focused on one character. So hearing you say that there's this idea of a big cast and, unique voice developing, I definitely think that this sounds like something that all of us would be like, oh, Mike Carey, more Mike Carey. And, the idea that it's also serialized, that there's a trilogy of novels, when that's, something we've come to expect from your storytelling, this bigger building idea. Now, how would you say? Because I've done a bit of research on the title, and one of the big things that I think is really interesting is that, from what I understand, that there's a lot of like the idea of nature is almost a danger, and how the world has kind of turned on people, and that's really a popular idea in fiction right now in a very accessible way. We actually see the X-Men doing it with how many evil plant creature people there are right now. And
Mm.
I think that there's a lot to be said in the way that we've started to view post-apocalyptic horror in new ways. It's not all zombies, the Walking Dead style. Is the post-apocalyptic element something you wanted to play with, or are you just excited about any sandbox?
No, I really love post-apocalyptic stories. I think they're just a great way of they're a way of posing a really interesting question. Post-apocalyptic worlds are worlds in which civil order has broken down. Most of us in our day-to-day lives, we enact the roles that are given to us, and as we go through life, we're following scripts. We're following sets of rules for interaction. And the question that gets answered in post-apocalyptic stories is, what are we when those frameworks and those rules fall away? What parts of the human kit are essential and what parts are accidental? What parts are just byproducts of the society in which we're brought up? That includes things like gender and sexuality and the weird taboos that form around those things. There's one of the characters in Koli, one of the most important characters outside of Koli himself, is a young trans woman, trans girl really, named Cup, who Koli meets. She's part of a cult, a sort of weird religion that's formed around a maniac named Senlas, and she leaves the cult and travels onwards with Koli. And I wrote her initially. She was meant to have a much smaller part in the story, but I found her a really, really interesting character to write. But I knew that I couldn't write her without getting some help, because she was a trans woman on the cusp of puberty. She was going to go through male puberty. I had no idea, or only the very, very most limited idea of what that might mean. So I approached Cheryl Morgan. And asked her to be a sensitivity reader on the books, and she was amazing. She became actually much more of a collaborator on the books. She gave me lots of stuff to read. She steered me towards online accounts that she thought would be useful, and she kind of, in many ways, gave me a framework through which gave me a lens through which to view Cup's predicament. I don't know how I got onto that. Taboos and
You're selling us on the book. That's how you got there. We're all about it.
taboos and shibboleths. There's no prejudice against trans people or against gay people in Koli's world, because I wanted very much to stress the point that there's nothing automatic about prejudice. Prejudice is learned from, it's something you pick up from the society around you. And Koli's never been exposed to it, so it never occurs to him for a moment that there's anything that he has a right to an opinion on Cup's transitioning. And there's a point in the third book when he meets somebody from our world. He meets somebody who is somehow managed to survive in some form into this future world, and they have a discussion about this. So I think post-apocalyptic stories are always about the here and now. They're always a kind of mirror held up to the here and now, to our own world. That's a banal thing to say, but it's true.
Yeah, we've talked about your Vertigo line, your X-Men stuff, and your prose work, but you also did work with Boom, with Suicide Risk, and it actually relates to X-Men a lot and kind of the concepts we've been talking about. I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of Suicide Risk for a bit. I just stumbled across it randomly at a bookstore, and I saw your name on it, so I picked it up, and then a friend really got me into it. So I was just wondering if you could talk about Suicide Risk for a bit.
Yeah, so it's a really fun project. I met up with Matt Gagnon at a New York comp, and he invited me to pitch to Boom, and Suicide Risk was the story I pitched. It grew out of an earlier story. The original form of it was called Fault Line, which was just the idea that there's another world that sends its criminals through to our world, its superpowered criminals through to our world, which is kind of the big MacGuffin in Suicide Risk. But I also like the idea of Leo's predicament, a character who has like incredibly extreme superpowers, but can't use them without endangering himself. It's called Suicide Risk because every time he uses his powers, there's a good chance that he's gonna die. as a result. Again, it's an ensemble. It starts out as his story, as Requiem's story, but as it goes on, it becomes much more about Leo's wife and daughter, about Diva, about all of the about Just a Feeling, all of these other people who've had their lives stolen from them, and then discover who they used to be and what they've lost. I wrote it for 2 years. I think it ran to only 25 issues, but it was a blast. It was really fun because I was kind of creating an entire superhero universe in miniature and trying to suggest this cast of thousands who were just off stage here in the background of the story.
Yeah, if you're a fan of listeners, if you're a fan of Mike's era on X-Men, I highly recommend Suicide Risk. There's a lot of really good themes in there for it.
And speaking of Mike's era on X-Men, Josh, you had said you wanted to bring something up that I feel like I probably spoke over you trying to bring up 1,000 times. I'm really sorry. But you had made a really interesting point about a book we both love, No More Humans.
Yeah, so after your era, you came back to do a follow-up to Brian Bendis's Battle of the Atom,
Right.
with the
Which
original...
had a follow-up by Pete Milligan in All New Dupe.
Yes, that's right. You know
I can't
what?
fucking stop with these connections, man. This is the bomb shit. I'm having the best day.
We're going galaxy brain here today on X's for Podcast. But no, Nico and I are big fans of No More Humans. And I think one of the most disappointing things for me is the way that it was kind of treated in the canon afterwards. And I know you mentioned that, you've followed or you've seen some of what was done with your characters like Blind Spot afterwards and Sai's work. And I'm wondering, in terms of something like No More Humans, where your final act and your resolution there was kind of not even just hand waved away, but like explicitly stated as something that hadn't happened in later books, as they were bringing the grown-up Jean Grey back in her Maxi series and in Matthew Rosenberg's Phoenix Resurrection. And if you would comment on just the editorial process of writing something not just outside, because it's not an ongoing, right? It's something that's kind of outside, but very unlike, the original graphic novel, God Loves, Man Kills, which feels like it could take place anywhere. No More Humans takes place in a very specific, narrow window of time in canon. Not as specific as All New Dupe, which literally tells you it takes place between these two panels on the same page of an issue, but takes place in a very specific time and has major ramifications and consequences for characters that then would go on to not be characters. I guess that whole process and the editorial connection there.
Yeah, I mean, I have absolutely no grounds for a sort of complaint or bitterness there, because the whole thing arose out of I'd left the books. I'd left the books with regret. The reason why I stopped writing X-Men was because I was making a go of the prose writing and the screenwriting, and I was still writing Unwritten, and it came to a point where I either had to stop writing Legacy or stop writing Unwritten. And because Unwritten was the thing that I co-owned with Peter, I didn't feel like I could leave that unfinished. So I had to give up Legacy, and I was sorry to do so. But Nick and Daniel had always said, you can come back. There's no reason why you can't sort of come and have another bite of the cherry. People do. And I carried on talking to them. And at a certain point, Daniel called me up and said, "Is there anything you'd like to, anything we could sort of tempt you to do?" And I said, but I can't do a book that's part of the line. I can't do a book that's in continuity because I haven't got the time to kind of get on top of it all. Because it's always like kind of running alongside a moving train and trying to jump on. I think that's the exciting thing about writing for a big franchise like the X-Men. But it's also the challenging thing. And I didn't want to half-ass it. I didn't want to come back on and do a sort of lame or subpar job. So they said,
we appreciate that, because not every previous X-writer has felt that way. So thank you very much.
So they said, well, why not do a graphic novel? Do an OGN, and it can be in continuity to the extent that it can bounce off something that's happening in the books now, but it can go off and do its own thing and come to a discrete end. And so that was very much the kind of understanding when I started to write it. So the fact that it's kind of been written out of continuity since is almost, it's kind of poetically fitting that it should be in some ways. But it was still great to do. Not least because, Salvador Larroca, he was the first artist I ever worked with at Marvel, and he was also the last artist I ever worked with at Marvel. That's great.
Well, now I have to ask, there's this amazing new title floating around the X office, X-Men Legends, which has already seen two pretty significant names return in the form of Fabian Nicieza and, everybody's queen of all godmother X-Men things, Wheezy Simonson. So, we know Peter David is coming back. If Legends were to say, hey, MR Carey, not MJ Carey, she writes bondage. Would you like to come back and would you like to tell a story? Is there a story you feel you have left in you to pick up and be like, yes, I have a ball I want to run into the end zone?
I would love, yeah. I mean, I would not say no. There's no way I'd say no if they offered me that. Do I have a ball like ready to throw into play? No, I don't. But it would be cool. It would be cool to come back. I mean, it's just always a joy to write those characters, and this feels like such an exciting time. It feels like a real renaissance for the X-Men.
We feel that way very much as a fandom. Our show had begun by covering the original classic Claremont years, and when Hoxpox, the House of X Powers of 10 era began, we just threw shift gear into overdrive and we jumped forward 40 years and we just started running this Hickman thing. And it has been such an exciting thing to see how your work has not just survived as fans of it at the time, but how your work has actually come to majorly influence what's going on in X-Men. We make a pretty big joke that it frequently seems like Magneto and Xavier in the Jonathan Hickman House and Powers era are kind of like they're a pretty comfortable gay couple. They're
Oh,
very leaning on each other, very, very healed from who they were. And I don't think that would be possible without the effort you put into repairing that narrative. One of the things that a lot of people felt, I remember actively being on the CBR forums at the time, and the big high praise for your book every month was, it's like somebody finally said, continuity is such a mess, let's fix it. And that sort of fix work really has continued on. And it feels almost like your band aid was made of nanites and they just kept replicating till the band aid was big enough to heal some, editorial wounds, not attacking any writers or anything at all. But over the course of a shared universe, damage gets done because of misaligned objectives and missed opportunities. And so that somebody was able to come in, that we're still talking about your work so much later, and that both comic writer Joe Glass and Alyssa Kwitney were both like, wait, there's more Mike Carey out there. I got to go read it. His X-Men, that we've had on the show have so reacted positively. It's just such a pleasure to get to ask you about this stuff. And I just want to thank you again.
thank you very much for that. I mean, talking to Connor Goldsmith on Cerebro and talking to you guys today is kind of like really, it's kind of like it's a time warp in a good way. It's taking me back to that time in my life, and it was a really special time.
Yeah, we hold your run in very high regard. For us, it's in those elite kind of high level runs on and definitive runs on X-Men, like
Up there with
Claremont
Morrison.
Morrison, what's
Yeah.
going on now with Hickman, and your run on Carey. Your run Carey. Your run on Legacy. Absolutely. So we had on a little while back VC's Virtual Calligraphy's Ariana Mar, who did an amazing job of really opening our eyes to kind of the inner workings and the process of a letterer. And you had mentioned earlier that writing comics at Vertigo really helped to sharpen and shape your form and structure as a writer. And Vertigo is known for, especially the early era of Vertigo, for having some of the most visceral and impactful lettering. And I
Mm,
was wondering how for
yes.
you as a writer, that process of visualizing the pages and working with a creative team, transferred or impacted you writing in a more mainstream superhero book afterwards, or even just during the time, getting to work in Vertigo with that type of creativity at lettering?
Well, yeah, you mentioned Todd Klein, which is sort of like you have to go there, don't you? It was astonishing to work with him. The way that he would create bespoke fonts for specific characters, and we leaned hard into that. There were storylines where you'd have Cestus of the Jin Mock, a character who can transform into whatever she last ate. So you'd meet her in different forms, but you'd know it was her because of the lettering, because of the font. And Lucifer likewise. It was absolutely amazing working with Todd. I think what Vertigo did for me, and Alyssa has played a very, very large part in this. It made me aware that comics are made out of pages, and that you can't write a comic without thinking of it in terms of pages. So the first thing I ever did at Vertigo, the first thing I ever wrote at Vertigo was Morningstar Option, and that had fully painted art by Scott Hampton. I mean, right out of the gate, there I am working with Scott Hampton. But I was writing it. I'd never seen a comic script, and I kind of had Watchmen at the back of my head. Maybe I had seen the script for Watchmen 1, which is at the back of the original trade collection of it. So I'm writing. I'm not exactly writing 9-panel grid, but I'm writing these ridiculously high panel counts. And Alyssa called me and reined me in. She said, "Think about this. This is painted art. If you're not giving it room to breathe, then you're doing it a disservice. So write with that in mind, and think of each page as being keyed around a panel, and always know what that panel is." So what I started to do, and I still do it now, I started to draw the comics before I scripted them. Nobody gets to see the drawings. They're terrible. They make stickmen look like Michelangelo. They're really, really crude, basic drawings, but they allow me to think in terms of the visual flow first, and then key the words to the visual flow. And they allow me to think about pacing. They allow me to think about framing, about page turns, and therefore about using the structure of the comic to handle reveals and so on. And then you're kind of making a map of the story before you script. It's a pre-scripting stage that makes the scripting itself effortless. And that was something that I learned at Vertigo, and something that I've used on every comic project I've done since.
I mean, I can literally point to that in your Vertigo work. Like, hearing you say it, it's one of those things where somebody was like, "Yes, that's the color blue," and now you're like, "Oh, that's what everyone's always talking about." You said that you think about painted art, like your work with John Bolton versus your work with Dean Ormston. I'm going to say his last name wrong.
Ormston.
Ormston, thank you. Versus your work with Peter Gross. It's you clearly script to the depth of the artist. And, Peter does these big, beautiful fantasy sequences where Dean does a lot of really minutia of grossness. Like, he really gets in there and makes that squish and that squirm feel like a squish and a squirm. And,
Yeah.
John Bolton is just, the master of painting. So, like, it's so interesting to hear. Yeah, I can see that in your work.
What I do is, if I'm writing for an artist I've never met before or never worked with before, I'll write very, very full script, and be really specific about a lot of stuff, and then I'll loosen up as we get into a kind of double act moving forward. With Peter, as I said, it's become with Peter and with Mike Perkins, both of whom I've worked with at like every stage of my career. We've become very, very relaxed, and the scripts are telegraphic. The scripts will just give a very, very short, impressionistic, this is the effect I want kind of thing. And then we'll actually sort of discuss the script, and we'll work from it, but allow it to grow in a more organic way. I think that's one of the unique things I think about comic storytelling, that because it's a collaboration of a different kind than the collaboration you get in a movie or a TV show.
It's interesting the way you describe that, because I have the No More Humans hardcover in front of me, and it includes your script in the back. And I was noticing that, your script is a little more sparse in terms of direction.
Hold on, I'm opening mine. Hold on,
but
I'm opening mine.
It definitely has some interesting descriptors in terms of on like the page 3 reveal of Cyclops' team of X-Men, and you're just like, like draw them looking, badass poses. But as you mentioned, writing for it and having had a relationship working with Salvador Larroca in the past, that must have been a description. Salvador Larroca would love just being told, draw them looking badass. Like that is right up his alley.
Yeah, case in point.
Oh man, like I'm so glad that Josh was like, it's in the back of the book so that everybody could like read along. That's awesome. I really appreciate that. It actually randomly, and it's so I meant to say it earlier. There is something so important about the fact that your work actually is almost this idea that prejudice is learned is such a humongous element of your work, and it stretches right back to the first arc of Lucifer proper, where I mean 6 card spread. I can't think of anything that defines prejudice is taught, not internal, with those characters and ultimately where everybody goes. I know the book is 15 years old at this point, but I don't want to spoil anything for anyone. So yeah, it's really fascinating how you are a writer who truly writes from a philosophy, and that philosophy doesn't really seem to waver at any point in the map of your fiction I've encountered.
I think it comes out in everything. You're right. I think if you have a view of the world, and it doesn't matter whether you set out to address a theme or whether you're just setting out to tell a story. Tell a good story, tell the best story you can. I think your worldview is imprinted on what you write, and I guess I also feel that this is going to sound bullshitty, but I sort of feel that. You have a responsibility for the stories that you put out into the world. Bad stories do harm. I mean, this was kind of the subtext of the Unwritten. Bad stories poison people. Bad stories hurt people. So you have a responsibility to tell stories that will. Do you know Kurt Vonnegut, the American novelist and journalist Kurt Vonnegut, who sadly is dead now? He coined the term FOMA. FOMA are lies, but they're healing lies, beneficial lies. He said, live by the lies that make you brave and strong and happy. And I think as writers, those are the lies we should be trying to tell.
The Judd Seuss arc of Unwritten really talks about how you can take a story and make it hurtful as
Yes.
well. The idea of the canker in the story that ultimately did significant damage to the interpretive zeitgeist of what it was meant to be. I
That
like. I
is.
really think that that's really prevalent in the work as well. I mean, and Kipling's, the Leviathan
Yeah.
material also. This idea of a story bigger than itself and what that represents.
Well, and as I mean, many of us who relate to disenfranchised minority communities, which is a common thread among X-Men fans, goes to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's concept of the danger of a single story, right? That if you tell a story about a white Christian heterosexual American male, and he's a bad person, it's not going to change what people think about white Christian heterosexual American males, because there are a billion other stories, and it has a very small impact on the shape and the perception of that type of person. But
Yeah.
if you tell a story about a Congolese woman, and it's the only story someone has ever read about Congolese women, it is going to completely shape and affect what they think of all Congolese women, because that is their only story on it. And bad stories can be very dangerous in that respect.
So apropos of that, we've just had the Twitter storm about Desire in the Sandman TV series on Netflix. The announcement that Desire will be portrayed as non-binary and will be played by a non-binary actor. And there's a sort of explosion of protest on Twitter by people who apparently were not aware that that is exactly how Desire is portrayed in the comic. And
Sun
it's
rises,
kind of
big news.
it's the only kind of way that makes sense, to portray Desire. It would kind of be insane to do anything different. But
Yeah.
yes,
And now we always do play a very short game. So would you be willing to just answer a quick question about X-Men favorites?
Okay.
Cool. It's a really light game. I tend to try and remember to mention it, but when I forget, I then feel really dumb. And this is one of those things where Kristen Stewart should be quoted a lot. She got her own Versace show, so we can quote Kristen Stewart. Kristen Stewart says that she hates being asked, "What books are you reading?" Because then for the rest of your life, you're going to hear, "Oh, and she was a fan of that thing." So we don't play like that, right? In this
Okay.
moment, right? If you could, put one mutant front and center in Krakoa, one person who you think, not that even you necessarily want to be the one to write it, but someone who should shine in this greatly changed age, who would it be? Now, this is for everybody, so Drew, Josh, and myself are going to answer as well. To get the ball rolling, for me, I think this would be a really great time to finally explore a character like Amelia Vaught. She is such a
Mm.
unique character who's had such little panel time, and I think she's due for a frenzy moment. And I think that would be really cool. I think she has cool looking powers, and I like it when we can take women who have played this role of kind of a male's ornament, and we can give them the story they deserve for being a character with motivations and feelings. What about you guys? Who do you think could stand a little bit more Krakoan spotlight these days?
Well, I can go. My answer is probably the same answer I always have, which
Is it
is
Rhapsody?
could not say Rhapsody because Rhapsody got in the spotlight last week. Nico,
I
they
know, I was
brought
so happy
Rhapsody
for you.
back. I was so happy.
Arturo and I had a conversation about how happy we were for you.
I'm a huge fan. I love Paige Guthrie. I think some of it was just me kind of hitting puberty and going into adolescence as Generation X was coming out, and falling in love with Paige Guthrie and having, Jono and Chamber being my kind of character, that I related to and entered into that. I always want more Paige Guthrie as long as she isn't having sex in the air above her mom's house. And so I would love more of her back in finding, trying to reassess, very analytically trying to reassess and find exactly what the right place for her to succeed and play a role with that, that strong type A, have to do this right, have to succeed, in a newly changed world that she never anticipated.
Shall I go next?
Absolutely, please do. As the guy
Okay.
who's
Well,
written X-Men, you kind of get to go whenever you want.
I used Indra Paraskavaska
Ooh.
in exactly one storyline on Legacy, and he was always a character that I wanted to come back to. I think he's fascinating because he comes from a non-Christian, non-American tradition. He belongs to a Jainite family. He has a strong adherence to the central tenets of the Jainite faith, including the first do no harm, the requirement to be a pacifist and not to hurt any living creature. Although sometimes in his time with the X-Men, he has scuffed across the edges of that commandment. I think it would be really interesting to see him in the Krakoa context.
Ugh, I would love that.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it would be Chamber. I don't really
Nice.
know too much about him. I haven't read Generation X, and it is very much on my to read list. And I don't know that I've ever actually read that much with him in it that I can think of at the top of my head.
Chambers are really. I love your choice of Chamber.
Mm.
Chamber hugely imprinted on both Josh and I, and the cool parts of Chamber grow up to be Josh, and the other parts of Chamber grow up to be me. So it's definitely a great choice. I love
Yeah,
that.
but his look for me, like his look is like if I was an X-Men, I would, his look would be pretty similar to mine. So
And all of his action figures were
Uh,
so super cool.
Oh,
yeah.
so awesome.
So awesome. They were so cool. They had the spark inside.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, they were great.
Chamber was my first cosplay as a kid.
That's
Cool.
amazing. I love that. I'm going to keep that mental image forever.
I made myself a Gen X belt buckle out of a Pringles lid, and I had a black leather jacket, and I rigged a contraption where I could have a flashlight kind of hanging from my neck and shining through like a sheer scarf that covered my face and went down to my chest. And so I had like Chamber, like the light kind of visible through the scarf, and I was Chamber for Halloween one year because I
That
wanted
is
to be
awesome.
Chamber.
That is amazing. Well, Mike, I want to thank you so much for giving of your time so freely today. It has been literally one of the things that your run comes up one of the most of any run on the show. And it is just such a pleasure and an honor to get to talk to you about your work. Now, not to be, too ridiculous with honor, but yeah, I mean, it's work that brought us all a lot of joy that we've spent our free time discussing for some number of years. So I really want to thank you for coming out and for all of the amazing work you've done on so many titles that have meant so much to all of us. Clearly, there's titles that I didn't know you worked on that Drew brought up, and incredible points I had never even considered that Josh brought in. And I just want to thank you so much for giving us so much to talk about all these years and so much to enjoy.
Oh, thank you, Nico. Thank you, guys. It's been wonderful to talk. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Hey guys, if you like that cut from X's4 Podcast, you'll be sure to like some of our other materials. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out these other amazing videos here at X's4 Podcast.